Gauley Bridge, West Virginia. The spring of 1931. A man named Roosevelt Singleton walks out of the tunnel for the last time on May 2nd. He is 31 years old. He came from somewhere in the South. He came for the work. He had been drilling inside Gauley Mountain for months. On May 14th, 12 days after his last shift, Roosevelt Singleton is dead. The death certificate says pneumonia. It was not pneumonia. His lungs had turned to stone. Silica dust, inhaled in quantities no human body is built to absorb, had crystallized inside him. The tissue that was supposed to move air had become rigid scar. He suffocated from the inside. He was not the first. He was not the last. He was one of at least 764 men who died this way, and that number is almost certainly low. The new Kanawha Power Company broke ground on the Hawk's Nest Tunnel on March 31st, 1930. The project was straightforward in its engineering concept. Divert water from the New River through a 3-mile tunnel in Gauley Mountain to a hydroelectric plant downstream, which would generate power for an electrometallurgical plant in the town of Alloy, West Virginia. The contractor was Reinhardt and Dennis of Charlottesville, Virginia. To fill the workforce, Reinhardt and Dennis sent recruiters south. The Great Depression had begun. Work of any kind was scarce. Men came from Georgia, Alabama, the Carolinas, Mississippi. Most of them were African American. They came because there was nothing else. 3,000 men would work inside the tunnel during its construction. At the height of operations, the crews worked in 10-hour shifts around the clock, 25 cents an hour, 60 hours a week. The mountain they were drilling into was almost pure silica. This was discovered very early in the project. Core samples taken before construction began had made it clear. The rock was high-grade silica-bearing sandstone in the sections where drilling would be heaviest. Silicosis, the disease caused by inhaling silica dust, had been documented in medical literature for over 2 centuries. It had been known as potter's rot, quarryman's disease, grinder's rot. The pathology was understood. The prevention was understood. Wet drilling, which uses water to suppress dust at the drill bit, had been an accepted safety practice for years. Adequate ventilation to clear dust from confined spaces was standard knowledge. Respiratory protection existed. None of it was used inside the Hawk's Nest Tunnel. Reinhardt and Dennis drilled dry. The interior of the tunnel became a white cloud, so thick that workers could not see 10 feet. Men emerged from the mountain, covered in white dust from head to boot. The project was completed 6 months ahead of schedule. Reinhardt and Dennis received a substantial cash bonus for the early delivery. The first men began to die within months of starting work. The symptoms were consistent: shortness of breath, a cough that would not stop, fatigue that grew worse no matter how much a man rested. Local physicians were puzzled at first. They were seeing young men, many in their 20s and 30s, collapse into respiratory failure at a rate and speed that did not match any disease they knew. Silicosis in its chronic form takes 20 to 30 years to kill. What the Hawk's Nest workers had was something different. They had been exposed to silica dust in concentrations and for durations so extreme that they were developing acute silicosis. The disease was killing them not in decades, but in months. Dr. Leroy Harless performed autopsies on workers who had died. He opened their lungs. What he found looked like white sandstone. The tissue had been replaced. These men had not died of pneumonia. They had died of silicosis. But the company had its own doctors, and the company doctors had a different name for what was killing the workers. They called it tunnelitis. They wrote tunnelitis on the death certificates. They wrote pneumonia. They wrote anything except silicosis, because silicosis would have made the company legally liable. Tunnelitis and pneumonia would not. Workers who became too sick to work were driven from the company camps. Supervisors, according to testimony later given before Congress, forced sick men from their beds at gunpoint. Men who could not walk were put on trains and sent home to die somewhere the company would not have to see them. African American workers who died in the camps could not be buried in white cemeteries. There was no colored burial ground nearby. A funeral parlor in Somersville found an open field on a farm belonging to a woman named Martha White. Workers were driven there at night and buried in unmarked graves. No attempt was made to notify their families. Shirley Jones was 18 years old when he died. His father, his uncle, and his brothers had all worked in the tunnel alongside him. They all developed silicosis. They all died. His mother received $800. The families of African American workers received less. Unmarried black men were valued at $400. Married black men at $600. Unmarried white men at $800. Married white men at $1,000. The price was set. The bodies were buried. The tunnel was open. The first newspaper account of the disaster appeared in the Fayette Tribune on May 20th, 1931. The story described workers becoming sick, men dying, families unable to find out what had happened to their relatives who had come to West Virginia for work. The story did not travel far. The Depression consumed everything. There were disasters of every kind across the country. The Hawk's Nest story was regional, remote, and its victims were largely African American men whose deaths the national press was not in the habit of treating as significant news. The lawsuits came anyway. 538 of them. Workers and their families seeking compensation. The legal process was not clean. The attorneys who represented the workers settled the cases for $130,000. Half went to the attorneys. The settlement terms included the handover of all plaintiffs' records to the defense. The records were handed over, and then the records were lost. The workers received their share of what remained. The companies received immunity from further prosecution. No one at Reinhardt and Dennis faced criminal charges. No one at the New Kanawha Power Company faced criminal charges. The tunnel stayed open. The hydroelectric plant ran. The metallurgical plant in Alloy received its power. The congressional investigation came 5 years later. In 1936, the United States House of Representatives Committee on Labor held hearings on the Hawk's Nest tunnel disaster. Representatives of the tunnel companies declined to attend. One submitted a written statement that called the testimony of workers who appeared before the committee slanderous rumors and hearsay. The letter concluded with a sentence that the congressional record preserved. We know of no case of silicosis contracted on this job. Workers who had survived testified. They described the white cloud inside the tunnel. They described being denied the 30-minute breaks in clean air that were supposed to clear their lungs between drilling shifts. They described supervisors who knew men were sick and sent them back into the mountain anyway. The congressional committee issued its findings. It concluded that the Hawk's Nest tunnel had been completed with grave and inhuman disregard for all consideration for the health, lives, and future of the employees. The committee placed the death toll at 476 for the period 1930 to 1935. Later research by epidemiologist Martin Cherniak estimated the true toll at 764. A 2002 study by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health estimated close to 1,000 dead. The exact number will never be known. The records were lost in the settlement. The death certificates said pneumonia and tunnelitis. The graves were unmarked in a cornfield in Somersville. The paymaster of the tunnel project was interviewed about the deaths. He was asked if he had known that the workers were being exposed to dangerous levels of silica dust. His answer entered the historical record. He said he knew they were going to kill them within 5 years. He said he did not know they were going to kill them so quickly. That sentence is what remains of the official acknowledgement that the people responsible for the Hawk's Nest Tunnel understood exactly what was happening inside the mountain. They knew silicosis killed. They knew wet drilling prevented it. They chose dry drilling because it was faster. They finished 6 months ahead of schedule. They collected their bonus, and somewhere between 700 and 1,000 men stopped breathing because of the choice they made. The poet Muriel Rukeyser visited Gauley Bridge in 1936. She came because she had read about the tunnel disaster in a labor publication. She was 22 years old. She spoke with survivors, with families, with the doctors who had tried to understand what was happening in the camps. She published her poem sequence, The Book of the Dead, in 1938. The sequence is documentary poetry. It incorporates testimony, legal records, corporate documents, and the voices of the people who survived. One line from the sequence described what Rukeyser saw in the survivors she met. They had become mountains of breath. The Book of the Dead was one of the first sustained literary responses to the Hawk's Nest disaster. It kept the story alive in a form the legal process had tried to bury along with the workers. Josh White, the blues musician, recorded a song called Silicosis is Killing Me under the pseudonym Pinewood Tom in 1936. The song was another form of testimony, another way the story survived. What came from the Hawk's Nest tunnel disaster was not fast and was not easy, but it came. In 1935, the West Virginia legislature passed a new workmen's compensation law that added silicosis to the list of diseases covered by compensation. By the end of 1937, 46 states had enacted similar laws. In 1936, the first National Silicosis Conference was convened by Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, following a joint resolution of the House and Senate that had been driven by the congressional investigation into Hawk's Nest. The conference findings were published in 1937. They established a framework for understanding silicosis as an occupational disease and for the obligations of employers to prevent it. The path from those findings to actual enforcement was long and contested, but the direction was set. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 established federal authority over workplace safety for the first time in a comprehensive form. The legislation that created OSHA was the culmination of decades of advocacy that traced its origins through cases like Hawk's Nest. The current federal standard for permissible exposure to respirable silica was significantly strengthened by OSHA in 2016. The rule reduced the allowable exposure limit by 50%. It is estimated to save approximately 600 lives per year and prevent 900 new cases of silicosis annually. The standard exists because the disease was documented. The disease was documented because men died. The men who died in the Hawk's Nest Tunnel are part of the chain of evidence that produced the rule protecting construction workers and miners today. There is a memorial on Highway 19 near Summersville, West Virginia. It was installed in 2009. It reads, "This memorial honors an estimated 764 tunnel workers who died." The farm on Martha White's property, where many of the African-American workers were buried in unmarked graves, is a few miles from the memorial. The graves are still unmarked. The families who never received word of what happened to the men who went to West Virginia for work never got a complete accounting. Sheila Flack Jones, whose uncle George Flack died on May 20th, 1931, 12 days after his last shift, learned about his death from historical research decades later. Her father had grown up believing his brother had run away. He never knew the truth. She said she was heartbroken that her family had died thinking he had run away and never knew the real truth. That is what the buried records and the lost documents and the falsified death certificates produced. Families who spent their lives wondering what happened to men who had gone to a mountain in West Virginia to earn 25 cents an hour. The tunnel is still there. It still diverts water from the New River to the hydroelectric plant downstream. It still generates power. It is still an engineering achievement. The men who built it are in a cornfield. Most of their names are not on the memorial. Most of their names were never written anywhere that survived. What did survive was the pattern. The geological surveys that showed the silica content of the rock. The medical knowledge that explained how silica dust destroyed lungs. The engineering practice that had already established wet drilling as the standard response. Everything that was needed to protect the workers existed in 1930. The choice to use dry drilling was a choice. The choice to drill without ventilation was a choice. The choice to call the disease tunnelitis was a choice. The paymaster knew. The contractors knew. The geological engineers knew. The workers who came south from Georgia and Alabama and the Carolinas for 25 cents an hour and 10-hour shifts in the white cloud inside the mountain did not know. They breathed what they were given to breathe. The law that came from their deaths is protecting the next man in the next tunnel. That is what their deaths produced, and that matters. Even though their names are not on the wall, even though their graves are not marked, even though the death certificates say pneumonia, they built something they did not intend to build. They built the evidence that said this could not be allowed to happen again. It took 30 years and an act of Congress and the work of lawyers and poets and doctors and labor organizers to turn that evidence into law. But it turned. The mountain is still there. The tunnel is still there. And the law that says the air workers breathe must be tested is still there too, built on the lungs of the men who came to Gauley Bridge in 1930 for 25 cents an hour and never came home. There is a second story inside the Hawk's Nest story that the record preserves but that rarely gets told alongside the disaster itself. It is the story of what the survivors did. The men who came out of the tunnel sick, who had watched their co-workers die, who had been driven from the camps and put on trains and sent home to wherever they had come from, did not disappear silently. Some of them found lawyers. Some of them testified before Congress. Some of them talked to journalists and poets and musicians who came to Gauley Bridge to understand what had happened. They were not passive recipients of what was done to them. They were participants in the effort to make it known. The 538 lawsuits required 538 decisions by sick and dying men to pursue legal action. That is not nothing. In 1931 and 1932, an African-American laborer in West Virginia who decided to sue an industrial contractor was taking a significant risk. He was suing from a position of almost no institutional power. He was suing in a legal system that had not historically prioritized his interests. He sued anyway. The settlement was inadequate. The legal process was captured by the defense. The records were lost, but the lawsuits created a public record. The lawsuits generated newspaper coverage. The lawsuits drew the attention of labor organizers and researchers and eventually of congressional staff. The congressional investigation of 1936 did not happen spontaneously. It happened because people had been pushing for it for years. Labor advocates, including the Congressman Vito Marcantonio of New York, had been raising the Hawk's Nest case in public forums and in the House of Representatives. Marcantonio stood on the floor of the House and said he personally believed that 2,000 men were doomed to die as a result of ruthless destruction of life by American industry. He was right about the destruction. The exact number remains uncertain, but the direction of his testimony was accurate. The industrial transformation that Hawk's Nest represents is part of a larger history of American occupational medicine. Before Hawk's Nest, there was no federal standard governing silica exposure in civil engineering projects. Mining had some state-level protections. But the Hawk's Nest Tunnel had been licensed as a civil engineering project specifically and that licensing meant that even the modest safety rules that applied to mines did not apply to the tunnel. The hole in the law was the hole the workers fell through. After Hawk's Nest, silicosis became a recognized occupational disease in 46 states by the end of 1937. That recognition meant workers and their families could seek compensation when the disease was contracted on the job. It was imperfect. The definitions of the disease varied by state. Exemptions for employers were common. Enforcement was weak, but the framework existed where no framework had existed before. The first National Silicosis Conference of 1936 established federal engagement with the problem for the first time. The findings of that conference formed the basis for subsequent federal rulemaking. The occupational disease provisions of the Social Security Act, the expansion of the Public Health Service's industrial hygiene work, the eventual creation of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act in 1970, all trace part of their lineage through Hawk's Nest and the evidence it produced about what happens when workers are sent into environments the law does not protect them from. The current federal silica standard is not adequate by some measures. Silicosis continues to occur. In the construction trades, particularly among workers cutting and grinding engineered stone countertops, a new wave of acute silicosis cases emerged in the 2010s. Young workers in countertop fabrication shops were developing the same rapid acute silicosis that killed the Hawk's Nest workers, because engineered stone contains silica in concentrations even higher than the Gauley Mountain rock. The 2016 OSHA rule that strengthened the permissible exposure limit was an important step, but enforcement remains a challenge. The workers who are most at risk are often in small shops, in informal employment relationships, in positions where they do not know their rights or do not feel safe asserting them. The distance between 1930 and today is long. The law has changed. The standards exist. The enforcement mechanisms exist, but the gap between the law and the actual conditions workers face in confined spaces with poor ventilation and inadequate dust control has not been fully closed. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel is still there. The current federal silica standard is still there. The workers who are most at risk are still there. And so is the question that the paymaster answered honestly in 1930-something. Did you know? He said yes. The question for every era is the same, and the answer determines everything that follows. The morning of March 31st, 1930. A man arrives at the work site on Gauley Mountain. He does not know that the rock inside the mountain is almost pure silica. He has been told there is work. He has been told it is 25 cents an hour. He has come from somewhere in the south where there is no work. He picks up a drill. He drills. The white cloud rises around him. He cannot see 10 feet. He breathes. He does not know what he is breathing. The people who sent him into that mountain know exactly what he is breathing. He keeps drilling. The mountain keeps giving up its white dust. He breathes for 10 hours. He comes out of the mountain at the end of his shift, white from head to boot. He goes back in the next day, and the day after that, for as long as his lungs hold. The law that says this cannot be done to another person in another tunnel is one of the things his lungs built. It cost everything he had, and it is still there. The epidemiologist Martin Cherniak spent years reconstructing what happened at Hawk's Nest. His book, published by Yale University Press in 1986, is called The Hawk's Nest Incident, America's Worst Industrial Disaster. Cherniak worked from death certificates, medical records, legal documents, congressional testimony, and interviews with survivors and descendants. What he found was a pattern of concealment that was deliberate and systematic. The company doctors who wrote tunnelitis and pneumonia on death certificates were not confused. They were performing a function. They were creating a paper record that attributed the deaths to causes that carried no corporate liability. The settlement terms that required plaintiffs to hand over their records and agree not to pursue further litigation were designed to eliminate future legal risk. The records that were subsequently lost had become legally worthless to the workers who had generated them, because the settlement had already been signed. The graves in the cornfield were not marked because marking them would have created a visible accounting of the scale of what had happened. Every piece of the concealment was purposeful, and it worked for years. Cherniak's estimate of 764 dead was arrived at through what he called conservative assumptions. He considered only workers who had spent at least 2 months inside the tunnel. He estimated from survival rates, from medical records, from the demographics of the workforce. He concluded that of the approximately 1,213 men who worked inside the tunnel for at least 2 months, at least 764 died from acute silicosis within 5 years. 63% of the long-term underground workforce dead within 5 years from a disease that was preventable, that the contractors knew how to prevent, that they chose not to prevent. The National Park Service maintains a site on the Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster. The page describes what happened and lists the key facts. It notes that silicosis has been designated as an occupational disease with compensation for workers. It notes that the tunnel workers at Hawk's Nest were not protected by these laws at the time. That sentence is the sentence that contains the mechanism. The tunnel was a civil engineering project. Civil engineering projects were not covered by the safety laws that applied to mines. The contractors knew this. They structured the project accordingly. The legal gap was not an accident. It was an opportunity. Closing that gap took the rest of the 1930s, significant parts of the 1940s, and ultimately the creation of a federal agency in 1970 to enforce the standards that existed. OSHA was not created in a vacuum. It was created because the evidence of what happened when workers had no federal protection had been accumulating since at least Hawk's Nest. The black lung disease that killed coal miners, the asbestos exposure that was killing shipyard workers, the silica exposure in mines and quarries and fabrication shops. Each disaster produced evidence. Each set of evidence contributed to the case for a federal agency with real enforcement authority. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration today enforces silica standards, asbestos standards, ventilation requirements, and dust control mandates that cover most American workplaces. The agency is imperfect. Its enforcement capacity is limited relative to the scale of American industry. The workers who are most vulnerable are still often the workers least likely to know their rights. But the agency exists, and its existence is traceable, in part, to the men in the white cloud inside Gauley Mountain. What does a life look like after silicosis takes hold? A survivor named George Robinson testified before the Congressional Committee in 1936. He described what had happened to him since leaving the tunnel. He said his breath got so short he could not walk across the floor. He said he could not work. He said he spent most of his time sitting and trying to get enough air. George Robinson was not old. Silicosis collapses the lung capacity progressively. Each breath becomes an effort. The body that was built for movement becomes a body organized around the act of breathing. A man who had drilled rock for 10 hours a day becomes a man who cannot cross a room. The disease does not kill quickly at this stage. It diminishes. It takes months and years to finish what the white cloud started. The progression is the punishment for having worked in the tunnel. George Robinson sat in a chair in a hearing room in Washington and described what that felt like. He was one of the witnesses. He was one of the ones who made it to Washington. The others were in unmarked graves in Somersville or had died on trains going back to Georgia. His testimony is in the congressional record. It has been there since 1936. It is still there. The tunnel is still there. Tourists can drive to a picturesque overlook above Hawks Nest State Park in West Virginia and see it. They can see the gate at the base of the mountain where the new river water enters the diversion system. They can see the mountain that the workers drilled through. The view is beautiful. The landscape of the New River Gorge is some of the most dramatic terrain in the eastern United States. Most of the tourists who stop at the overlook do not know the history of the tunnel they are looking at. The mountain keeps its silence. The law that the tunnel built is keeping its protection, and somewhere in a cornfield in Somersville, in unmarked ground, the men who paid for that law are still there. 25 cents an hour, 10 hours a day, a white cloud, and a law that says not again. That is what they left.